Hello everyone, it's Father Hayes. Welcome to our new series on the Mass, where we're going to be doing a series of videos on the parts of the Mass and what's happening in the Mass and the prayers. But before we start that, to put everything into a bit of a context, I wanted to talk about the space that we celebrate Mass in as a norm. Sometimes there are exceptions, but the norm is to celebrate Mass in a church. And so what is it that is different about a church than any other building, including any other building here at Nativity in the parish? So the first thing to think about is that we talk about in the Creed that we profess that God is creator of all things visible and invisible. So there's a visible creation that we can see around us, and there's an invisible creation. The angels, and God himself is not created, but he is also invisible. He's pure spirit. So we, as human beings, have a foot in each creation because we're body and soul. So we have a foot in the visible creation, the material creation around us, and we have a foot in the spiritual creation with our souls. And we are not souls trapped in a body. We are our bodies, as John Paul II talks about. So everything we talk about in terms of Christian worship involves the visible and the invisible. So to begin with, the 7 sacraments, we use visible things of creation, like in baptism, water, in the Mass, bread and wine. But then we are performing a sacrament where we are receiving God's very life, which is invisible. Grace is invisible. In a similar way, we have 7 sacraments in the church, but in a similar way, we can say that the church itself, the church building, is a sacrament with a small s. And what I mean by that is that the church, like every other building, is made up of things of the material world, right? Bricks, we have bricks around us, mortar, wood, glass. Glass ultimately begins as sand. We are surrounded by the material world in our buildings. But the church building is different than every other building. In fact, right here, we are in really a dividing point, because over here we have the lobby of the complex of buildings, right? We say it's the lobby of the church, but we have the lobby, we have the bathrooms, we have the offices. You keep going down, we've got the school, we've got the cafeteria, we've got the Father Martin Center, all right? We've got our little kitchen area over there for coffee and cookies after Mass. These are all made up of material things: bricks, wood, mortar, glass. So is this building. Bricks, wood, glass. But once I step down here, I am now in sacred space. There is something significantly different from this point on. And that's what I want to talk about. Because the church is not any normal building. We are part of a building complex here. But right now, as we step into the church proper, we are entering sacred space. We are entering a building that has been consecrated, has been set aside for a very specific purpose, and that is sacred worship. So we can say that the church is a sacrament small s because it's using material creation, but it's conveying to us invisible realities. So what happens when we set apart or consecrate a church for a specific purpose? Well, in a second, I'm going to go to another part of the church, and we'll tell you about some of the things that happen in the rite for dedicating a church. So when we dedicate a church, when we consecrate a church, when a church, this building is built, it's built using regular materials any construction project would use. But before it's officially used as a church, it will be consecrated. So one of the things that happens that people may not be aware of is that it's not just that the altar is dedicated and consecrated with sacred chrism, but the actual walls in 12 different locations will be consecrated with the sacred chrism that the bishop consecrated at the chrism mass every Holy Thursday. So that oil that's consecrated that one day of the year by the bishop is then used to consecrate this church, to set it apart for a specific sacred purpose. The other thing that happens is that the church building itself, the walls itself in 12 different locations representing the city of Jerusalem that we read about in Scripture, in the 12 spots in the city of Jerusalem, will also be incensed, as will the altar. And the incense, which is a very biblical image, it's not something we're necessarily used to seeing these days, but it's a very biblical image of our prayers being lifted up to God. That sweet fragrance, just as on the altar, when the altar is incensed, it's the sacrifice of Christ that is being lifted up in a special way to God the Father as a pleasing fragrance. And so the building is actually literally consecrated and lifted up to God for a sacred purpose. The other thing to talk about is the parts of the church. This area here, which where you are familiar with, it's where everybody sits, is known as the nave of the church. Now the nave, the word actually means ship. And the ancient Christians would consider the church building as a ship. And there's very biblical images in that. So think of the ship of Noah's Ark that saved the remnant of humanity in the flood. But also in the Gospels, there are many times where we hear about Jesus getting into the boat and that significant events that happen within the boat. Think of the storms that happen out on the water. And the apostles are in there in the boat with Jesus. And that's an image of the chaos around us and the sanctuary of the church. Think of also the great miracles of the great catch of fish happening from the boat, right? So the nave, where the congregation sits, is that image of the ship of the church. Now, that's very different than this area. So just as in the steps that enter into the church, we are entering into sacred space, the steps leading to the sanctuary, we are entering into an even more sacred space. In fact, the word sanctuary means holy place, because it is here that the altar is. It is here where the actual sacrifice of the Mass takes place, where in a very mysterious way, that historical event from 2,000 years ago is made present to us. It's as if we are entering a time machine, and time is standing still, and we are present at Calvary. But the sacrifice of Calvary was also beyond the historical, because it was one perfect sacrifice for all humanity. Everyone who came before Jesus and everyone who has come after Jesus in time is benefiting from that one perfect sacrifice of the eternal high priest. And so the sanctuary is even more sacred than the church itself. It is set apart for a very specific purpose. And so it's important for us to be reflecting on, when we are in the church, that we are not in any other normal place. So it's not a place for us to be overly casual. It is a place for us to be entering into the moment, entering into what is about to happen or what is happening in the sacrifice. What is God doing? What is he doing in gathering his people to him through this sacrificial offering of the eternal high priest? So there's much fruit for us to meditate on, just in an awareness that we are in an area that has been set apart, consecrated for a very specific and unique purpose.